These woods sure do get dark and cold at night. Good thing we got this fire going. Looks like it's going to be burning for another 30 minutes or so. Want to hear a campfire story to pass the time? Let's see. Have you ever heard the story of the Bell Witch hauntings? Okay, well, then here goes. I grew up in northern Tennessee, so naturally I heard the story all the time. I've heard the story told many different ways, but I'm going to tell it the way my grandpa told it to me. He first told me this story on a night like this while we were camping. You see, over the years, the stories surrounding these hauntings have become legends in Appalachia. But even at the time in the early 1800s, word spread quickly and captivated people. I even heard that the future 7th President of the United States, Andrew Jackson, who lived in the area of the hauntings, took 5 other men on a trip to the farm to investigate. On the way to the Bell farm, one of their 2 wagons got stuck in the mud, which naturally they blamed on the witch. As they camped on the property later that night and sat around a fire much like this one, telling old war stories, one of the men started wildly convulsing. Not much else is known about their visit, but they left the next morning, so something forced these brave war hero tough guys off the property. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's go back to the beginning. It all started in the early 1800s, 1804 if my memory's right. You see, a guy named John Bell outgrew his farm in North Carolina, so he moved his wife and kids to a bigger property in a remote part of Tennessee. It was extremely rural, and a few families lived in the area. But given John's outgoing and friendly personality, he quickly became very popular with the others in the area. And so, over the course of the next decade plus, the growing family settled into their life on the new farm. John and his wife Lucy had 3 more kids, now totaling 9. But that normal, peaceful life was about to change for good. One day, about 13 years after first moving onto the property, John was walking the farm like he did every day. Suddenly, he heard a rustling in his cornfield. He suspected that it was something normal, like a group of turkey hens that roamed the property, or maybe a deer. But what he saw as he pushed through a few rows of corn was anything but normal. Standing in front of him was some abomination that shook him to his core. What he later described seeing was a creature with the body of a dog and the head of a rabbit. That's right, body of a dog and the head of a rabbit. I mean, walking through a dang cornfield is creepy enough, but just imagine stumbling on that. Anyways, the thing just stared back at him with almost dead eyes. John happened to have his gun on him. I mean, it was rural Tennessee in the 1800s, so I reckon everyone had a gun on them most days. So he raised his gun and fired off a shot, but somehow the normally accurate John missed his target, and the thing just took off running out of the field and into the woods. If all that wasn't odd enough, as John gathered himself and walked to where the dog-rabbit thing was, he saw no sign of paw prints or broken corn. John was a practical man, so he didn't tell anyone about the experience at first because he just chalked it up to something odd but explainable. That day would mark the day that life went from normal to anything but normal. The second set of odd occurrences started a few months after the incident in the cornfield. 2 of the Bell daughters and 1 son were in the family living room when they heard knocking on the outside of the house. Assuming it was a neighbor, they got up to see who it was. But all at once, the knocking started all around the outside of the house. Almost like whoever was doing it was circling around the house and knocking. This knocking continued for days, and every time the family got up to investigate by looking through a window or walking outside, the knocking stopped and they saw no one. Again, just like with the cornfield incident, there were no footprints or signs that anyone had been outside the house. Like I said before, John was practical and well-respected. So he told his wife and kids not to mention anything about this to anyone outside the family. He was hoping that this must just be a practical joke, and whoever was doing it would get caught eventually, so he didn't want whoever was doing it to be tipped off. But John and the family never caught anybody knocking on the outside of the house. The knocking incidents stopped abruptly one Sunday in May of 1818. However, this night would start a third set of even weirder happenings. That night, as the Bell boys slept in their shared bedroom, they were awoken by what sounded like rats gnawing at their bedposts. It was rural Tennessee, so rats were everywhere. So they tried to just ignore it and go back to bed. But the sounds just got louder and louder, so the boys could not just sleep through it. They got up and looked at the bedposts, but as soon as they did, the noises just stopped, and the bedposts looked completely undisturbed. So they got back into bed. As soon as they closed their eyes, the gnawing noises started up again. But this time the noises were louder and faster. This continued all night and for the next 5 days. Just as the boys were somehow growing more accustomed to the noises, on the 6th night, the rat gnawing noises were accompanied by a faint, whispering voice of an old woman who seemed to be very quietly singing hymns. This faint singing, accompanied by the rats gnawing, continued for several days, with the whisperers progressively becoming more aggressive, I guess you'd say. John reiterated to his kids that they need to keep this information inside the family. But one night, one of the daughters was asleep in her bed and woke to what felt like someone pulling her hair and punching her in the arms. Whoever or whatever was doing this to her kept this up until the daughter just started screaming. John burst through the door and abruptly the hair pulling and punching stopped. After John saw the look on his daughter's face, along with her disheveled hair and welts on her arms, John broke his vow of silence. John reluctantly started sharing his story with his neighbors. The Bell's farm was nestled along the Red River, which was just off the Cumberland River in a town actually called Red River. The people of Red River had grown to love John and the family, so naturally they wanted to do whatever they could to help the family. In fact, one night, a neighbor spent the night at the house to see or hear firsthand what the Bell family was experiencing. And in fact, that neighbor did experience the same insane things that John had talked about. He heard the rats gnawing and the old woman softly singing hymns. He was so terrified that he left the next morning and never returned to the house. Other neighbors believed John as well, but assumed that one of the kids wanted attention and somehow orchestrated the whole thing. So, more neighbors stayed at the house overnight to try to prove that someone in the family was responsible for the happenings. Every time a visiting neighbor reported the same crazy things, and none of the kids or family members were unaccounted for when they happened, so the kids could not have been responsible. Gradually, people started to notice alarming changes in John. He just seemed to be a shell of himself. Normally engaging and friendly, he now kinda looked at you with a far-off look, as if he just wasn't all there. Maybe it was the lack of sleep or the constant stress, but people grew very concerned for John. Up until that point, John had seen that creature with the body of a dog and the head of a rabbit, and they heard all these terrifying noises, but they had never seen a person that was responsible for these events. That all changed one day, as one of the other daughters, named Betsy, walked out of their house to gather some eggs from the barn. As she walked towards the barn, she saw someone to her side that she had not noticed before. She was, of course, startled, but she assumed that the person was a neighbor. The person walked towards the house that Betsy had just left. As Betsy peered over at the person, she saw a woman in a long black dress with a bonnet on her head, walking with her head down. Again, Betsy thought this must be a neighbor, so she called out and waved, but the woman just kept walking slowly to the house. Cautiously, Betsy started following the woman, studying her as she approached the woman from behind. She got about 5 feet from the woman and said, "Hello," in a louder voice. Just then, the woman stopped, threw off her bonnet, and started pulling at her hair. Betsy was horrified to see mats of hair falling from the woman's hands and onto the ground. So, terrified Betsy took off running past the woman and back towards the house, never looking back. Frantically, she burst through the front door and closed it. One other sister and a brother were home at the time, and they were alarmed by their sister's demeanor. Betsy somehow stammered and stumbled out some sentences telling them what she saw. The brother walked quickly to the window, and he saw this woman in black put her bonnet back on and walk slowly towards the house. After everything they'd been through, he was sick and tired of whatever was haunting his family, so he ran and got a rifle. By the time he got back, the woman was now walking around towards the back of the house, but now she was joined by 3 small children dressed in black, slowly walking behind the woman. The Bell son burst through the back door of the house and raised his gun to shoot a warning shot. When he fired that shot, the woman and the kids took off running to the woods at a speed that didn't seem human. When they got to the woodline, they each climbed a different tree. After a brief pause, the 4 trees that they climbed started to sway back and forth, and 4 whispering voices were coming from the trees that started to get louder and louder as the swaying intensified. About a minute into all of this, the trees were swaying so hard and fast that it seemed like the giant trunks of the trees would snap any second, and the voices were almost deafening. However, all in unison, the swaying and the voices stopped. The sun just stood there and stared at the woods, frozen for several minutes, before running back into the house to check on his sisters, who also witnessed this event from one of the back windows. Now, by October of 1820, John was not doing well. That's putting it mildly. He spent most of his days just laying in bed, expressionless, and staring up at the ceiling. He barely ate or drank, and the few times he did get up and walk around, he'd have strange, unnatural convulsions. He'd just suddenly lose all control of his body and start convulsing on the floor, with his limbs contorting in unnatural positions. These would last a few minutes, and then he would return to normal and walk back to his bedroom, where he just returned to looking up at the ceiling. Clearly, whatever was haunting them was taking its toll on John the most. 9 days before Christmas, John's wife Lucy came to the bedroom to check on John. But he was not moving at all. He was breathing, but other than that, there was no sign that he was still alive. Worried for her husband, she called for one of their sons and told him to look in the medicine cabinet for something to help John. The son dashed to the cabinet and opened it up, but all of the medicine was gone, except for one bottle of smoky dark liquid that no one had ever seen before. As they studied the mysterious vial of liquid, they heard a faint, crackling voice say, "That's what I gave to the old man to help him sleep." Horrified at the sound of the voice, Lucy threw the vial of liquid into the fireplace. When the vial broke in the fire, a huge flame shot up from the chimney. The next day, John was unfortunately discovered dead in his bed. Once he died, all the strange things that haunted the family instantly stopped. To this day, no one's sure what or who was haunting the Bell family. Many think that whatever was haunting the family originated from a cave that was located on the Bell's property. But there have been no credible hauntings in the area since the death of John Bell. Oh, dang, man. You look a little pale. Well, looks like the fire's just about burned out. Hopefully, you get to fall asleep tonight.